The moment you notice something felt different, that moment mattered more than you think. Most people move through life without ever noticing anything at all. They react, they rush, they repeat, but they never observe. If you're here, listening to this right now, it means something interrupted your autopilot. And that interruption is not random, because reality doesn't change when you force it. It changes when you notice it. And once you notice certain things, you can't unsee them. That's when the shift begins. Most people believe reality is something happening to them. Events appear, situations unfold, and they assume all of it exists independently of their awareness. But here's the truth that unsettles most minds. Reality doesn't fully exist until it's observed. Not philosophically, functionally. The world reacts differently to someone who is present than to someone who is unconscious inside their own life. That's why two people can be in the same situation and experience completely different outcomes. One is reacting, the other is watching, and the one who watches always gains leverage, because observation introduces choice. And choice disrupts patterns. The moment you notice what you used to unconsciously repeat, the system can no longer run automatically. That's why awareness feels uncomfortable at first. It removes the illusion of inevitability. You thought your habits controlled you because they were powerful, but they controlled you because they were invisible. The second they become visible, their grip weakens, not through effort, through recognition. This is why people who begin observing themselves report feeling exposed, not to others, to themselves. They see what they've been doing all along, and seeing it changes everything. Most people spend their entire lives avoiding this moment. They stay busy, they stay distracted, they stay immersed in the drama of their circumstance. Because if they stopped and actually observed, they'd have to confront an unsettling reality. Much of what they think is happening to them is actually happening through them. Their reactions create outcomes. Their patterns attract situations. Their unconscious behaviors generate the very problems they complain about. And recognizing this is terrifying, because it means you can no longer blame external forces entirely. It means you have to see your own participation in the cycles you hate. But here's what makes this truth liberating instead of condemning. The moment you see your participation, you gain the power to change it. Not through self-punishment, not through forced behavior modification, through simple, honest observation. Because patterns can't survive scrutiny. They survive in darkness, in unconsciousness, in automatic repetition. But the moment you shine the light of awareness on them, they begin to dissolve. Not because you're fighting them, but because you're finally seeing them clearly. And clarity is the enemy of dysfunction. Think about the last time you repeated a mistake you swore you'd never make again. In the moment, it felt inevitable, like you had no choice, like the situation demanded that response. But if you could rewind and watch yourself from outside, you'd see something different. You'd see the exact moment the pattern activated. You'd see the split second before the reaction took over. You'd see the tiny window where choice still existed. That window is always there, but you can only access it through observation. When you're inside the reaction, the window is invisible. When you're watching the reaction, the window becomes obvious. And once you've seen it once, you start seeing it everywhere. In conversations that used to spiral out of control. In emotional responses that used to feel automatic. In choices that used to feel like compulsions. The window opens, and in that opening, everything changes. Not because reality changed, but because your relationship to reality changed. You stopped being a passive participant in an automatic process. You became an active observer of a malleable system. And malleable systems respond to awareness in ways that fixed systems never could. This is why people who develop observational capacity report that life becomes simultaneously easier and more complex. Easier because problems lose their emotional charge. More complex because they see nuances they used to miss entirely. They notice the quiet tension before the argument. They sense the shift in energy before the situation escalates. They feel the pattern forming before it completes. And in that noticing, they gain the most valuable thing any human can possess. Time. Not clock time. Experiential time. The space between stimulus and response. The gap where freedom lives. Most people have no gap. Something happens, and they react instantly. Someone speaks, and they respond automatically. A feeling arises, and they become it immediately. But observers have a gap, and in that gap they choose. Not what to do necessarily. Sometimes they choose to do nothing, but they're choosing. And that makes all the difference. Because a life of choices, however small, is fundamentally different from a life of automatic reactions. One is a life you're living. The other is a life that's living you. And the moment you begin to observe, you cross from one to the other. Permanently. Think about this carefully. Have you noticed how problems lose their grip the moment you stop emotionally drowning in them? The argument that always escalates until one day you simply watch it happen. The anxiety that tightens until one moment you notice the sensation instead of becoming it. The pattern that keeps repeating until you recognize it before it completes itself. That pause is everything. Most people think change comes from action, but real change begins in the pause before action. Notice how your life behaves when you're unaware. You rush conversations. You react defensively. You chase clarity. Now notice what happens when you observe instead. You hear what people actually say, not what you fear they mean. You see when emotions rise before they control you. You catch the pattern forming while it's still weak. That's why moments of awareness feel strange, almost unreal. Because you're no longer fully inside the story. You're watching it unfold. And here's the part most people overlook. The moment you observe a pattern without immediately trying to fix it, the pattern begins to weaken on its own. Because patterns feed on unconscious participation. Awareness starves them. Think about the last time someone provoked you. If you reacted immediately, the situation escalated. Your words fed their words. Their energy matched yours. And the pattern completed itself perfectly. But if you've ever caught yourself before reacting even for just 3 seconds, you know what happens. The other person's energy has nowhere to land. Their pattern expects resistance, and you give them space instead. And in that space, something shifts. Not because you strategized, but because you weren't unconsciously participating. This is how observation dismantles loops that seemed permanent. You stop being the fuel. And without fuel, patterns can't sustain themselves. Now apply this to your internal world. The thought that spirals into anxiety, the memory that triggers shame, the impulse that derails your progress. What happens when you observe these without commentary? No judgment, no analysis, no immediate attempt to make them go away. Just pure observation. They lose intensity, not because you defeated them, but because you stopped feeding them attention disguised as resistance. Resistance is still participation. Observation is neutrality. And neutrality dissolves what conflict reinforces. This is the mechanism most self-help avoids explaining. They tell you to think positive, to reframe, but observation doesn't require reframing. It requires honesty. The honest noticing of what is actually happening without the story you've been telling yourself about it. And that honesty is more transformative than 1,000 affirmations, because it doesn't try to cover up the pattern. It exposes the pattern to light, and light is what patterns cannot survive. Here's a practical example of how this works. You have a pattern of procrastination. Traditional advice tells you to use willpower, create better habits, manage your time. But observation reveals something different. You notice that procrastination isn't about laziness. It's about the subtle anxiety that appears right before you start the task. That anxiety is so familiar you don't even register it anymore. It just feels like not wanting to do it. But when you observe carefully, you see it's actually fear. Fear of not doing it perfectly. Fear of being judged. Fear of confronting your own limitations. And the procrastination is just your system's way of avoiding that fear. Now you could try to overcome the fear. Force yourself to act despite it. But observation offers a different path. You simply watch the fear arise. You don't run from it. You don't fight it. You don't analyze why you have it. You just notice it's there. And something remarkable happens. The fear peaks and then naturally subsides. Not because you conquered it, but because you didn't feed it with avoidance. And in the space after it subsides, action becomes natural, not forced. This is what people mean when they say things flow for them. They're not superhuman. They've just learned to observe their internal obstacles without becoming them. And without becoming them, the obstacles don't block progress. They just move through like weather. This is the pattern recognition loop in action. You notice the pattern. You observe without interfering. The pattern weakens. New behavior emerges naturally. It's not a technique. It's a way of being. And once you understand this way of being, you can apply it to everything. Relationships that felt impossible become workable. Emotions that felt overwhelming become manageable. Goals that felt distant become achievable. Not because you gained new skills, but because you stopped unconsciously sabotaging yourself. And the end of self-sabotage is the beginning of everything else. Most people never reach this point because they abandon observation too early. They notice a pattern once or twice and expect it to disappear completely. But patterns have momentum. They've been running for years, maybe decades. They don't dissolve after one observation. They dissolve after sustained observation. The kind of observation that continues even when the pattern seems unchanged. The kind of observation that persists even when progress feels invisible. Because here's what's really happening beneath the surface. Every moment of observation weakens the pattern's neural pathway. Every instance of non-participation reduces its emotional charge. Every second of awareness creates space for new possibilities. And over time, those micro-shifts compound into a complete transformation. But only if you keep observing. Only if you trust the process even when the outcome isn't immediate. Because transformation isn't an event. It's 1,000 tiny moments of choosing awareness over automation. And if you can make that choice consistently, even the most stubborn patterns eventually surrender. Not to force, to presence. This isn't mystical, it's structure. Reality operates like a feedback system. Unconscious behavior produces predictable outcomes. Conscious observation interrupts that loop. When you observe, three things happen simultaneously. First, emotional charge decreases. Second, Third, timing slows down. This is why people who are highly aware appear calm under pressure. They aren't detached from life, they're detached from compulsion. And compulsion is what reality responds to most aggressively. When you react unconsciously, reality pushes back harder. When you observe calmly, reality softens. Not immediately, but consistently. This is the observer effect in lived experience. The act of watching yourself changes how the system interacts with you. You stop broadcasting urgency. You stop signaling desperation. You stop reinforcing old timelines. Instead, you project stability. And stability is what reality aligns with. This is why forcing outcomes fail, and why noticing shifts succeeds. Let me be more specific about how this feedback system operates. Every action you take sends information into the world. Not just the literal action itself, but the energy and intention behind it. When you act from desperation, you're sending a signal that says, "I don't have what I need." And reality responds to that signal. People sense your neediness and pull away. Opportunities close because you're grasping too tightly. Outcomes slip further away the harder you chase them. This isn't punishment, it's physics. Desperate energy repels what it seeks because desperation indicates instability, and instability disrupts the natural flow of things. But when you observe your desperation without becoming it, the signal changes. You still want the outcome, but you're no longer destabilized by wanting it. And that shift in frequency changes everything. People sense the difference immediately. Where before they felt your need, now they feel your groundedness. Where before they sensed your anxiety, now they sense your presence. And presence is magnetic in ways that pressure never is. This is why the same person can approach the same situation twice and get completely different results. The situation didn't change. Their energetic signature changed. And energetic signature determines outcome more than strategy ever could. Think about job interviews, first dates, sales calls, any situation where you need someone else to say yes. When you approach from a place of need, you're unconsciously communicating, "I need this more than you need me." And that immediately creates an imbalance. The other person feels the pressure. They sense your attachment to the outcome, and psychologically they pull back. But when you approach from a place of observation, the dynamic shifts completely. You're present but not desperate, interested but not attached, engaged but not grasping. And that creates space for genuine connection. Space for the other person to actually see you instead of just sensing your need. This is why people who stop caring often get what they wanted. They didn't actually stop caring. They stopped being controlled by their caring. And that detachment allowed reality to respond naturally instead of defensively. Now apply this understanding to every area of life. Financial pressure, observing it reduces the frantic energy that blocks opportunities. Relationship conflict, observing it reveals solutions that emotional reactivity obscures. Creative blocks, observing them dissolves the mental tension that prevents flow. In every case, observation introduces space. And space is where reality has room to reorganize itself. This is the structural reason why observation works. It's not about thinking positive. It's not about pretending problems don't exist. It's about creating enough internal space that external reality can shift without resistance. Because here's what most people don't understand. Reality wants to flow toward resolution, toward coherence, toward the path of least resistance. But unconscious behavior creates resistance everywhere. Resistance in the form of urgency, resistance in the form of attachment, resistance in the form of trying to force outcomes. And resistance is what keeps you stuck. Not because the universe is blocking you, but because you're blocking the natural movement of things. Observation removes that blockage, not by trying to remove it, but by simply not adding to it. And when you stop adding resistance, reality can finally move the way it was trying to all along. This is why solutions often appear right after you stop trying so hard. You didn't give up. You got out of the way. And getting out of the way is the most powerful thing you can do. Here's how this plays out in real time. You're facing a problem that feels impossible. Every approach you've tried has failed. Every strategy has hit a wall. So you observe instead of forcing. You notice the fear underneath the frustration. You notice the assumption that it has to be hard. You notice the attachment to one specific outcome. And in noticing, you stop reinforcing those patterns. You don't replace them with positive thinking. You just stop feeding them energy. And in that space of non-feeding, something new emerges. A perspective you hadn't considered. An opportunity you hadn't seen. a solution that was always available but required a clearer state to perceive. This is how observation changes reality, not by manifesting, not by visualizing, by removing the static that was blocking clear perception. And clear perception reveals what was always there. The system hasn't changed. Your ability to work with the system has changed, and that changes everything. Here's where the shift becomes personal. The moment you stop asking, "How do I change this?" and start asking, "What is actually happening right now?" everything slows down. You notice tone instead of words, energy instead of appearances, patterns instead of events, and suddenly things that felt overwhelming feel manageable, not because they disappeared, but because they no longer own you. This is where control returns, not control over people, not control over circumstance, but control over response. And response is the only leverage that ever mattered. The moment you can observe without immediately interfering, you gain access to timing. And timing is power. Most people act too soon or too late because they're reacting instead of observing. They feel pressure and move immediately. They sense discomfort and try to eliminate it instantly, but the observer waits, not passively, acting. They watch for the right moment. The moment when action will land. The moment when words will be heard. The moment when change will stick. And that moment is never when you're in reactive mode. It's when you're in observant mode. This is why masters of any craft appear to have supernatural timing. Athletes who seem to know where the ball will be. Negotiators who know exactly when to speak and when to stay silent. Leaders who sense the perfect moment to act. They're not guessing, they're observing. And observation gives you time, not more hours in the day, but more space within each moment. When you're reactive, moments collapse into chaos. When you're observant, moments expand into clarity. And in that clarity, you see exactly what needs to happen. Not what you wish would happen, not what you fear will happen, what actually needs to happen. This is the shift from hoping to knowing. And knowing doesn't come from thinking harder. It comes from observing more accurately. Let me show you how this power shift manifests in everyday situations. You're in a conversation that's becoming tense. In reactive mode, you jump in immediately. Defend yourself, correct the misunderstanding, prove your point. But in observant mode, you pause. You notice the other person's body language. You sense the emotion behind their words. You feel the pattern that's trying to activate. And you wait. Not because you're avoiding conflict, but because you're waiting for the right moment to speak. The moment when they're actually ready to hear you. And that moment almost never arrives during peak emotional intensity. It arrives in the pause. The brief window when the emotion crests and begins to subside. That's when your words will land. That's when understanding becomes possible. And by waiting for that moment, you completely change the outcome of the conversation. Not through manipulation, through accurate timing. This is power that doesn't look like power. It looks like patience. It looks like calm. It looks like nothing is happening. But beneath the surface, everything is happening. You're reading the system in real time, sensing where it wants to go, waiting for the moment of maximum leverage. And when that moment arrives, the smallest action creates the largest result. This is how observers operate. They don't force, they align. They don't push, they flow. They don't exhaust themselves trying to change everything. They wait for the moment when change becomes effortless. And those moments exist everywhere, in relationships, in personal development, in creative work. But you can only access them through observation, because timing isn't something you create. It's something you recognize, and recognition requires presence. The kind of presence that can hold steady while everything around you is moving. The kind of presence that can wait while everyone else is rushing. The kind of presence that trusts that the right moment will reveal itself, and it always does. Not on your preferred timeline, but on the timeline that actually works. This is why people who develop observational capacity seem to have things work out for them mysteriously. It's not luck. It's time. They've learned to sense the rhythm of situations and act in harmony with that rhythm. While others are fighting against the current, they're moving with it. And moving with the current is always faster than fighting against it, even when it looks slower. Here's what this looks like in practical terms. You want to ask your boss for a raise. Reactive approach. You schedule a meeting immediately because you need the money now. Observant approach. You watch for the moment when your boss is in the right mindset, when your recent work is visible, when the company is doing well, when the timing aligns naturally. Same goal. Completely different execution, drastically different results. Because the observer understands something the reactor doesn't. The same request made at different moments yields completely different outcomes. And those moments aren't random, they're readable. If you're paying attention, if you're observing instead of forcing, if you're willing to wait for alignment instead of demanding immediate resolution, this is the power shift that changes everything. From pushing life to partnering with it. From forcing outcomes to recognizing opportunities. From exhausting yourself to working efficiently. And it all begins with a simple question. What is actually happening right now? Not what you think should be happening, not what you fear is happening, what is actually happening. And when you can answer that question accurately, you gain access to leverage you didn't know existed, the leverage of perfect timing. And perfect timing is the difference between struggling for years and achieving results that seem effortless, not because the work wasn't done, but because the work was done at exactly the right moment. But here's the layer most people never reach. Observation isn't just about watching reactions. It's about noticing what changes after you notice. Reality responds subtly at first. People speak differently around you. Situations lose urgency. Old triggers stop triggering. And then comes the real test. Can you remain observant when nothing dramatic happens? Because awareness without reaction creates silence. And silence makes people uncomfortable. Most people abandon observation here. They mistake calm for stagnation. But silence is where reality recalibrates. This is the phase where outcomes shift invisibly. And if you rush it, you reset the old loop. Let me explain what happens during this silent phase. When you first begin observing, changes feel immediate. You notice a pattern and it weakens. You catch a reaction and it dissolves. But then you enter a period where nothing seems to happen. You're still observing. You're still aware. But the dramatic shifts stop. This is when most people panic. They think they've lost the ability. They think observation stopped working. So they go back to forcing, back to reacting, back to the old way. But here's the truth. The silent phase is where the deepest recalibration happens. Reality is adjusting to your new frequency. Patterns are dissolving at the root level. Timelines are realigning behind the scenes. But none of this is loud. It's happening in the substrate of your experience. And if you can remain observant during this phase without demanding immediate proof, the shifts that emerge will be structural, not superficial. This is the difference between temporary change and permanent transformation. Temporary change happens when you force a different behavior. Permanent transformation happens when you observe until the old pattern can't sustain itself. And that takes patience. Not the patience of waiting passively, the patience of continuing to observe even when it feels like nothing is happening. Because something is always happening. You're just looking for the wrong kind of evidence. You're looking for external validation, big moments, obvious shifts. But reality shifts in whispers before it shifts in earthquakes. The person who stops calling you suddenly. The opportunity that appears out of nowhere. The internal calm that replaces chronic anxiety. These aren't accidents. They're the result of sustained observation. And sustained observation means you keep watching even when the show seems boring. Because the boring phase is where reality is rewriting itself. Here's what's actually happening during the silence. Your nervous system is stabilizing at a new baseline. Your energy field is becoming coherent instead of scattered. Your patterns are losing their energetic charge. And when patterns lose their charge, they stop attracting matching circumstance. This is why people who've been stuck in cycles for years suddenly break free without doing anything dramatic. They didn't force the change. They observed until the change became inevitable. And inevitable change is the only kind that lasts. So if you're in the silent phase right now, don't abandon observation. This is where the real work is happening, not in your efforts. In reality's response to your stillness. Think of it like planting a seed. After you plant it, nothing visible happens for days, sometimes weeks. You might doubt whether the seed is even viable. You might wonder if you did something wrong. You might be tempted to dig it up and check. But beneath the soil, everything is happening. Roots are forming. The structure is developing. The foundation is being built. And if you disturb that process by digging it up, you destroy what was growing. The same is true for observation. The silent phase is the root-building phase. Nothing looks impressive above ground yet, but beneath your conscious awareness, your entire system is reorganized. Neural pathways are being rewired. Emotional patterns are being released. Your energetic signature is being recalibrated. And all of this happens in silence, not because nothing is happening, but because the most important transformations happen below the surface of conscious awareness. This is why spiritual traditions talk about the dark night of the soul. It's not darkness in the sense of suffering. It's darkness in the sense of invisibility. The phase where growth is happening but you can't see it yet. And the temptation is to abandon the process because you can't measure the progress. But if you can stay observant through this phase, what emerges on the other side is unshakable. Because it's not built on temporary effort. It's built on structural transformation. And structural transformation means you've changed at the level of identity, not just behavior. Here's how you know you're in the silent phase. Old triggers don't provoke you like they used to, but you're not actively trying to stay calm. You just are. Situations that used to create anxiety now feel neutral. Not because you're suppressing the anxiety, but because it's genuinely not arising. People who used to irritate you suddenly seem less bothersome, not because you're being more tolerant, but because the pattern that made them irritating has dissolved. These are the signs of deep recalibration. And they're easy to miss because they don't feel dramatic. They feel natural, like this is how it's always been. But that's precisely the point. True transformation feels natural because it's not an overlay. It's a return to what was always underneath once the patterns cleared away. And the silent phase is where those patterns complete their dissolution. So if you're there right now, trust the process. Keep observing, not because you're trying to force something to happen, but because observation is now your natural state. And in that natural state, reality has room to reorganize itself without your interference. This is the advanced level of observation, where you're not observing to get a result. You're observing because that's who you've become. And when observation becomes identity rather than technique, that's when reality transforms completely. If this message resonates with you, it's because you've already tasted awareness before. You've felt moments where everything slowed down, where clarity appeared without effort, where reactions lost their power. That means you're not here to force reality. You're here to witness it accurately. Observers don't chase meaning. Meaning reveals itself to them. And once you become someone who observes, you can't fully return to unconscious reaction. That's why this path feels lonely at times. Most people don't want awareness. They want relief. But awareness gives something better than relief. It gives direction. And direction is what creates a life worth living. Relief is temporary. A moment of ease followed by the return of pressure. But direction compounds. Every moment of clear observation adds to your understanding. Every pattern you recognize weakens permanently. Every choice you make from awareness builds momentum. And over time, you realize something profound. You're not trying to become someone different. You're becoming more accurately yourself. Because most of what you thought was you was just unconscious conditioning playing out on repeat. The defensive reactions, not you. The anxious overthinking, not you. The people-pleasing patterns, not you. Those were programs running automatically. And observation reveals them as programs rather than identity. This is the liberation that awareness brings. Not freedom from life's challenges, but freedom from mistaking temporary patterns for permanent self. When you observe long enough, you start to sense what's actually you and what's just noise. The quiet knowing beneath the mental chatter. The steady presence beneath the emotional waves. The clear direction beneath the confused urgency. That's you. Everything else is just weather passing through. And once you know the difference, you stop defending the weather. You let it move. You let it shift. You let it dissolve. Because you're not afraid of losing yourself anymore. You know what's real and what's temporary. This is why people who've developed true awareness seem unshakable to others. It's not because nothing affects them. It's because they know what they are and what they aren't. And that knowing creates an anchor that no external storm can dislodge. But here's the part that surprises most people. Once you become an observer, reality starts treating you like one. Opportunities come that require discernment, not hustle. People appear who value depth, not performance. Situations arise that reward patience, not force. It's as if reality recognizes the shift and responds accordingly. And maybe it does. Or maybe you're just finally aligned with a different frequency, and now you can perceive what was always available but required a clearer signal to access. Either way, the result is the same. Life becomes less about controlling outcomes and more about recognizing which outcomes are already trying to emerge. And when you stop blocking them with unconscious interference, they arrive naturally. This is the ultimate advantage of the observer state, not power over reality. Partnership with you watch. Reality reveal. You respond. Reality adjusts. And in that dance, everything you actually need finds its way to you. Not because you manifested it, but because you stopped being in the way of it. Let me tell you what happens when observation becomes identity. You stop explaining yourself constantly, because you're no longer defending a position. You're simply present with what is. You stop needing validation from others, because you can see clearly what's working and what isn't. External opinions become interesting data points, not sources of identity. You stop fearing silence, because silence is where you live now. Where others feel awkward emptiness, you feel spacious presence. You stop rushing conversations to conclusions, because you're comfortable letting things unfold. You trust that clarity will emerge when it's ready. You stop trying to convince people, because you understand that people change when they're ready to see, not when you're ready to explain. These aren't things you practice. They're natural expressions of who you've become. And becoming an observer is the most significant identity shift any human can undergo, because it moves you from being a character in the story to being the awareness witnessing the story. And from that vantage point, everything looks different. Problems that seemed insurmountable reveal themselves as temporary patterns. Relationships that seemed complicated clarify into simple dynamics. Life that seemed chaotic organizes itself into recognizable rhythms. Not because you gain special knowledge, but because you remove the distortion that was obscuring what was always clear. And here's what makes this shift permanent. Once you've seen from the observer state, You can't fully believe your own drama anymore. You might still experience emotions. You might still have preferences. You might still encounter difficulties. But underneath all of that, there's a part of you that's watching. And that part doesn't get lost in the storm. It watches the storm pass. And after enough storms, you realize something that changes everything. You are not the storm. You're the sky the storm moves through, and the sky is never damaged by weather. This is the identity that observation reveals. Not an identity you construct, an identity you discover. The one that was always there beneath the patterns, beneath the conditioning, beneath the noise. And once you've found it, everything else becomes optional, not meaningless. You engage with life fully, but you're no longer imprisoned by it. You participate completely, but you're no longer defined by outcomes. You care deeply, but you're no longer destroyed by loss. This is what it means to be an observer, not detached, not cold, not superior, just clear enough to see reality as it is, clear enough to respond appropriately, clear enough to let go when holding on serves nothing, and that clarity is the greatest gift observation offers, control, not certainty, not permanent happiness, just clarity. And clarity is enough, because with clarity, everything else finds its place naturally. After this video ends, pay attention to what you notice without trying to change it. A delay, a reaction forming inside you. Don't interfere. Reality always responds to sustained awareness, and what shifts next won't be loud, but it will be unmistakable. You'll notice someone treating you differently without you doing anything different. You'll feel a pattern losing its grip without you fighting it. You'll sense timing opening up without you forcing it. These aren't coincidences, they're confirmations. Confirmation that observation works. Confirmation that awareness changes reality. Confirmation that you're on the right path. And the more you notice, the more reality will show you. Not to prove anything, but because that's how the system functions. Awareness attracts more awareness. Clarity attracts more clarity. Observation deepens with practice. And you're already practicing just by listening to them, just by considering these ideas, just by noticing what you notice. So don't stop now. The shift has already begun. And every moment you remain observant strengthens what's trying to emerge. You don't need to do anything dramatic. You just need to keep watching. Because the moment you notice reality, reality notices you back. And everything changes from there. But let me be specific about what to watch for. In the next few hours, notice your first impulse in any situation. Not to change it, just to see it. That impulse is your default program. And seeing it clearly is the first step to no longer being controlled by it. In the next few days, notice when you feel the urge to rush, to speed up a conversation, to force a decision, to make something happen faster. That urge is fear disguised as urgency, and observing it removes its power. In the next few weeks, notice patterns completing themselves without your participation. The argument that fizzles out on its own, the anxiety that passes without intervention, the problem that solves itself once you stop interfering. Those are signs that observation is working, and the more you notice them, the more they multiply. Because reality responds to what you pay attention to. When you pay attention to problems, problems proliferate. When you pay attention to patterns dissolving, dissolution accelerates. This isn't positive thinking. It's accurate observation. You're simply noticing what's actually happening instead of what you fear is happening. And what's actually happening is usually more workable than your fears suggest. Now here's what makes this practice sustainable. You don't need to be perfect. You don't need to observe everything. You don't need to never react. You just need to notice one moment more than you did yesterday. One pattern you see today that you missed last week. One reaction you catch before it fully activates. That's enough, because observation compounds. Each moment of awareness makes the next moment easier. Each pattern you recognize makes the next pattern more visible. Each time you choose observation over reaction, you strengthen that neural pathway. And over time, observation becomes automatic. Not in the sense that you're not present, but in the sense that presence becomes your default. Instead of defaulting to reaction and occasionally finding presence, you default to presence and occasionally fall into reaction. And when you do fall into reaction, you notice it faster. You course correct more quickly. You return to observation more naturally, until observation isn't something you do. It's something you are. And that's when life truly transforms, not through dramatic events, but through the quiet accumulation of thousands of observed moments. Moments where you chose awareness over automation. Moments where you noticed instead of reacted. Moments where you watched instead of drowned. Those moments are building something. Something more stable than any forced change. Something more lasting than any motivated effort. Something more real than any constructed identity. They're building you, the actual you. The one that was always there underneath the programming, and that you doesn't need fixing. So as you move forward from here, remember this. You're not broken. You're just obscure. And observation removes the obscuration, layer by layer. pattern by pattern, moment by moment, until what remains is simply what was always true. And from that place, everything becomes possible, not because you've gained supernatural powers, but because you've removed the obstacles that were blocking natural flow. And natural flow is more powerful than any amount of force. So keep watching, keep noticing, keep observing, not because you're trying to achieve something, but because observation is the most honest way to move through life. And honesty always leads somewhere worth going, even when you can't see the destination yet, even when the path seems unclear, even when nothing dramatic is happening. Trust the observation. It knows where you need to go, and it will take you there, one noticed moment at a time.